In this video, I'm going to quickly run through some photography slang that you might encounter out in the field. This is words that I haven't covered yet, or some terms that are a bit outdated and not super applicable to your photography advancement, but they could be helpful to know. So let's start from the top. I got about 30 I'm going to run through, all in alphabetical order. The first word is artifact. So artifact generally refers to a spot within your photograph that's a little bit distorted or has some noise issues or is just a problem. Usually it is from a camera malfunction or some kind of lens distortion, and it can also sometimes emerge depending on how you are editing your photos. So if you hear this word tossed around, it means that you need to fix that area, usually with a clone stamp tool or a healing tool of some sort. The next word is aspect ratio. So we talked about this a little bit when I went through camera sensors, but essentially aspect ratio is the size of your sensor. So the most popular aspect ratio is 4:3, but you might also hear the term 16:9 tossed around, or 1:1. 1:1 is actually a square format. So if you watch a movie like The Lighthouse, the entire movie is shot in 1:1, and that movie is great for learning composition. I would say it's a masterclass. You might also hear 3:2. There's a variety of different ones, but you're most likely going to be working with 4:3 aspect ratio. The next word is banger. So this is a word that pretty much emerged out of YouTube photography vlog culture. It basically just means that you got a good shot. So you might hear someone say, I got a banger last weekend, or this shot's a banger. It means you took a good photo. The next word is barrel distortion. So this implies that you're shooting with a wide angle lens and the edges start to get a little bit stretched. So you can usually fix this in post-production with some distortion tools. I go over this in the editing part of my course, but if you hear that word barrel, it usually refers to something with the lens. Next word is bulb. So this word relates to your shutter speed. So if you put your shutter speed in bulb mode, that means as long as you're holding the shutter button down, it's going to keep that shutter open and make it a long exposure. Generally, you wouldn't do this by actually holding down the shutter button on your camera because you're obviously going to get some camera shake. Usually this is more applicable if you have an intervalometer. You would set it to this mode if you want to do something longer, or if you have a remote shutter like a Bluetooth shutter or one that connects with a cord. The next word is candid, which I'm sure you already know this word, but it relates to portrait photography, and what it means is you caught someone in a pose without them knowing it. So if you got a candid shot of someone, usually it looks more natural, it's not posed, it's not set up. Next word is digital negative. So this is a word that essentially means DNG, the abbreviation, which is Adobe's format for raw photos. It's essentially a universal format that you can convert to if you say you want to send someone else your raw photos. One thing you'll notice is that depending on what brand camera you're shooting with, you'll have different file extensions for your raw photos. So for example, Sony photos are .arws, Nikon's are .nef, Canons are CFW, I believe. Yeah, CRW. I don't shoot with Canon, so. But you know, depending on what camera you shoot, you might have a different extension for those. Next word is dust bunnies. So these are essentially sensor spots within your camera. So if you get dust within your sensor, then some people call them dust bunnies. Easiest way to clean this out is with a air blower that's made for sensors, or you can get your camera professionally cleaned if that doesn't work. Next word is fast/slow. So you might hear someone refer to a lens as that's a fast lens or that's a slow lens. A fast lens means that the lens has a low aperture, like f1.4 or f1.8. A slow lens usually means it has a higher aperture that it can go down to. So for example, a lens that could only go down to f4 or f5.6, for example. The reason they say this is because these lenses can achieve the same exposure as an average lens, but with a faster shutter speed. Next word is flare. So this generally pertains to lens flare. So this happens when you shoot directly into the sunlight. Your lens can have some effects where you'll get like a light ray that pops up or a star formation of sorts. It's really up to the artist if you want to include these in your shot or not. Some people like to have flares to give it a little bit of oomph to it, and then some people find them not very professional. So it's really up to you. I would say the reason these happen more often than not is if you have a dirty lens or your lens is scratched, or especially if you're using a filter on your lens, like you're putting another piece of glass in front of it, this can also exuberate that effect. So watch out for that. Also, if you shoot at a lower f-stop, that's how you will get more stars in your shot. So if you're looking for those sun stars, shooting at something like f14 will give you more of those rays popping from the sun. Fun fact. Next word is glass. So some people just refer to lenses as glass. So they say, that's some big glass over there, which usually means that you're shooting with a bigger lens, like a telephoto lens, like 600mm, or that's got small glass, or what kind of glass you're shooting with. That's how that word is used. Next word is grad filter. So this is basically just gradient filters, AKA those filters that have a higher density of light stopping it on the top than the bottom. For a while I was confused about this, so that's why I'm including it. Next word is halos. So halos essentially mean generally on points of high contrast in your image, like the horizon, you might get an effect called a halo, which is where you have a bright light that's on the outskirts of it. Usually this doesn't happen in camera, it happens in the editing world if you over edit your photos. But if you do hear that word, that's what it means. It can be fixed really easily with some clone stamp tools that I'm gonna go over in the editing part. Next word is HDR, which stands for high dynamic range. And this is essentially a fancy word for exposure blending. So as we talked about earlier in this course, you can use bracketing to take multiple shots at once of different exposures and then manually blend them in Photoshop together. HDR is essentially a mode where you can select all of those photos of different exposures and then click it, and it will automatically blend them all for you based off what it calculates is the best exposures for the best parts of the image. It also usually includes some edits to the contrast, the amount of white balance, all of that fun stuff, so it's a little bit more automated. Generally, I wouldn't recommend people using this method, which is why I didn't talk about it in the course, because manual exposure blending is much more accurate and you have much more control. And I do go over this in its entirety in the exposure blending video and sky replacement video, actually. One also thing to note is that a lot of phones have a setting that says HDR on it. This essentially means that it does all of this automatically. So you usually take one photo on your phone and it will on its own take multiple photos and blend those exposures together to achieve that higher dynamic range. And this is just to compensate for the fact that most phones have very small sensors. So if you're shooting in a spot with high dynamic range with only your phone, then it could be in your best interest to hit this button. Next word is hot shoe. So hot shoe is essentially the metal piece on the top of your camera that you could use to strap in an external microphone to it or a flash to it. Generally, you don't want to get this wet. So if you are out shooting in the rain, make sure this is covered in some way. A lot of cameras just come with a plastic cover on it, but it does connect electronically to that flash, so be careful in that regard. Next words are low key and high key. And people generally use these words to refer to shooting with a lot of light in your background or no light in your background. So high key would mean there's a lot of white or brightness in your background. Low key would mean there isn't a lot. Generally, these words are used more in the portrait world, so you probably won't hear them much in landscape photography, but if you do hear them, that's what they mean. Next word is metering. Metering is how your camera determines the exposure of a certain scene. So how it says that it's overexposed or underexposed within your camera. It's a little bit of an outdated word because back in the day when there were film cameras, you had to have a manual light meter that you had to use on your own in order to determine how lit up the scene is. Nowadays, cameras do this automatically. So if you have an option in your camera, you might be able to see a bar on the bottom that tells you how exposed that image is. And there's also 4 different metering modes in your camera that you can switch to. So the main metering mode is matrix, and this basically just picks a bunch of parts of your image and determines how bright it is, and then that's what it uses to determine the exposure. The next mode, and honestly, you're gonna use that mode for 99% of shooting. So these other 3, I'm just gonna briefly explain just in case you ever need them for very specific circumstances. Next is center metering. So this basically tells the camera to determine the exposure of what's in the very center of the frame. So this is good if you're shooting a portrait, for example, and the background's blown out. Then you can basically tell your camera that it's okay that that background's blown out because I want that effect. Another mode is spot metering. So this basically tells your camera that wherever you're focusing, that's how it's going to determine how exposed the shot is. So this is good if you're tracking birds, for example, a moving object, and you're not too worried about the exposure around it. You just want the bird to be in focus. The last metering mode is highlight priority. This just ensures that there's gonna be no parts of your image that are blown out. It prioritizes those highlights to tell you not to blow those out. So if you're very picky about blown out or having any white at all in your photo, like I am, this could be a good option to use on occasion. So that's metering. Next word is muddy. So a lot of people usually refer to muddy with colors. Muddy usually means you have colors that are blending together. Maybe there's too many colors and it's starting to form a brownish or blackish color. Muddy can also mean a lack of detail in your shot. So perhaps shots that have low contrast and are a little bit flat are muddy. Next word is nifty 50. And this essentially means a 50mm lens that usually stops down to something like 1.8. People call it a nifty 50 because this is the best prime lens for all around use. It's not too wide, it's not too zoomed in, and they're usually very small. So you can literally just throw these lenses in your pocket and it's good for commercial shoots, portraits, landscapes, literally anything. It's a good lens that's all around if you want only a 1.8 prime lens. Next word is OVF or EVF, and this stands for optical viewfinder or electronic viewfinder. Optical viewfinders are really only found in DSLR cameras. It's where you look through the viewfinder and it shows you what you're seeing through a mirror. So you're actually seeing what's there. Electronic viewfinders, it's literally taking that light into the camera and then showing you what the exposure is going to be. So this is applicable to mirrorless cameras. Next word is pixel peeping. So this generally refers to a person that looks at your photo, zooms in a ton, and then criticizes it in one way or another. So they'll say, there's a little bit of noise in this corner here, or it's not tack sharp in this spot here. Usually it's a person that's jealous of how great your shot is, and they're just looking for a way to criticize it based on your lack of solid technology or your lack of perfection in a shot. So completely ignore these people. We all know that the point of photography is to evoke an emotion, and technicalities are not as important. But there are some people in the world that the technicalities are everything, the gearheads, so that's where we'll find these pixel peepers. Next word is retouching. And retouching is mainly a term that's used in the portrait community. It basically means editing your photos, except they say retouching because it generally refers to skin. Skin can be the hardest part to edit with portraits because you want that skin tone to be perfect, especially with the way the light's hitting it, and then you get pores that are open, pimples, acne, blocking all that stuff out, making the skin look smoother, enhancing the color of the eyes, teeth, lips, all that fun stuff. So generally you hear the word retouching in the portrait world. However, it might be applicable to landscape photography if you have a real goofball talking, so keep that word in mind. Next word is run and gun. So run and gun generally is a statement if you're going out on a shoot and it's gonna be very fast moving and you have a very nimble setup. So say you're going out with a bunch of friends, they're fast hikers, they're not photographers. You can say, I'm gonna just run and gun this shoot, which usually means you have a small camera, maybe one lens, and you're just gonna be taking photos fast as you're going along. You're not bringing a tripod, you're not doing focus stacks, exposure blends, it's just run and gun. Next term is spray and pray. And this basically just means something is happening in front of you so fast that you don't even have time to focus or set up the shot. You essentially just press the focus button, aim your camera in the right direction, have it on burst mode, and just shoot and hope you get a shot in focus. This could also be applicable if it's really bad weather conditions out. So sometimes when it's absolutely pouring out and my glasses are wet and there's a piece of plastic in front of my camera, I can barely see the camera, I'm just hoping things are getting in focus. That's what spray and pray means. Definitely not the best technique, but sometimes it's all you can do. Final word is straight out of the camera. So this basically means you haven't edited your shot yet. So for example, if you want to show your friends that you got this dope photo but you haven't edited yet, you can say this is straight out of camera. So those are all the slang words I wanted to go over. 99% of what will get you through most photography conversations and make you sound like a competent photographer if you can understand and use these words on occasion. All right, let's hop into the next video.